The Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Arch Hunter, the host of the program. Our American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present day. And today we want to welcome back as one of our very special guests, Dr. Mike Carpin. So Dr. Carpin, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Arch. Always nice to be here.
Thank you for coming. Dr. Carpin has a bachelor's degree from Gettysburg College, a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University, and a doctorate from the University of Penn. And today, Dr. Carpin is going to be talking to us about the presidency of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. So, Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Arch. I guess today's edition is we file this under things aren't always what they seem. Now, as a loyal Gettysburg College graduate, and not only a Gettysburg College graduate, but a history major, obviously the figure of Dwight Eisenhower looms very large over Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was an area that he went to as a young man after his time at West Point. He wanted to settle there after the Second World War on a farmhouse, a short distance from the Gettysburg battlefield. And then events take over and he becomes president of the United States, and Gettysburg, where he retires to. He has an office at the college. It was always a figure that loomed very large for me as a student. And then it wasn't until I was a senior and took my research seminar on Eisenhower that I really began to peel back the layers of what I think is an extraordinarily consequential presidency, and something that even in our own time, although it's recovered, that very, very, very underrated under the radar presidency. And so that's what we'll if you'll allow me, we'll start to peel that back today and take a look at this really interesting dynamic time period in American history.
And we just had a couple of programs from one of our colleagues, Dean Blahos, talking about the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant comes from no political background and has a fairly disastrous presidency. Eisenhower comes from no political background, has a very successful presidency. So share with our listeners, Mike, please, about the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and seeing things are a lot different than what they seem to be, as you just stated.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting, and there's kind of two lines of thought there. There's actually a very famous quote from Harry Truman, and it took Ike and Harry Truman a long time to get along with one another. It wasn't until the funeral of John F. Kennedy where they both attended and shared a couple of drinks and started to patch over some of their bad feelings. But Truman very famously said when Ike was elected president that, that poor Ike, he's going to think that this is the Army, and he's going to order people around, and he's going to say, do this and do that, and nothing's going to happen, and he's not going to be very successful, which I think greatly misunderstands Ike's role during the Second World War. You're not talking about a battlefield commander like Ulysses S. Grant. I think that's an important distinction to establish. If you look at what Ike's role was, the supreme head of the Allied Expeditionary Force that was defeating the Nazis during the Second World War, it is an extraordinarily political job. I really think there's no other way to describe it. He's not only coordinating this absolutely massive war effort in the European theater on the scale of which we've never seen before or since, but you just have to think about all of the personalities that he's juggling, all of the political leaders that he's trying to get to play nice with one another. All of the very strong personalities in the command structure around him. I mean, imagining dealing with Bernard Law Montgomery, George Patton, George C. Marshall, Omar Bradley. Let's look on the political end. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Charles de Gaulle, who, when you go to the museums in France today, basically say that he single-handedly won the Second World War all by himself. The Allies aside, de Gaulle went into the bunker in Berlin and shot Hitler in 1945, and then snuck back out. Ike is basically gets all of these figures to play nice in the big sandbox of the Second World War. So he is an extraordinarily shrewd political operator. What's misunderstood? One of the things that people need to understand about the Eisenhower presidency, and I'll never forget this. When I told my grandmother at some point during my senior year of college, my grandmother, whose husband had been in the Second World War and fought in the Battle of Bulge and all those things, I told her that I was going to be doing a research paper on Dwight Eisenhower, and she said to me very caustically, she goes, "What are you going to write about? Golf?" Because that's what he did for 8 years. He golfed and he let other people run the show, and he was just the figurehead. That is such a common perception of Ike during the 1950s, and it's all over the place. If you look at, for example, at the political cartoons of Herblock from the Washington Post, he regularly paints Eisenhower as this bumbling, detached, doddering, sort of grandfatherly, a really nice guy, but not really in charge of the scene. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. And I think that that's what the historical record has demonstrated over time. And there's lots of examples where we can illustrate that sharp difference of the public persona and the private persona and the reasons for that.
And Ike has been in the military since 1918 when he graduated from West Point. He's had this marvelous, magnificent career in the military, and then continued to stay in the military. He's 61 years old. What would possess Eisenhower to even think about running for the presidency at 61 years old after this phenomenal career?
Yeah, I think that this is a critical difference from today as well. And I think that this is also something to understand about where Ike is coming from in terms of his presidency. He considered World War II the pinnacle of his career, defeating the Nazis. I think that is without much disagreement as to that. Why does he run in 1952? He's actually actively courted by both political parties in 1948 because his profile is so high. Apparently, there's a rumor that Truman invites him to run as president with Harry Truman as his vice president. I think they have a meeting and discuss that. But at the time that Ike was with NATO and didn't want to move away from those commitments. Why does he run in 1952? All right, let's look at the math of the 1952 campaign. Harry Truman is not running. So politically damaged by the Korean conflict that he's not even running for re-election. So in less than 20 years we're going to have two presidents not run for re-election because of really unpopular wars in the Asian subcontinent. So Truman's not running. It's really hard. Think of how long the Democratic Party had been holding the White House. The odds are that the Democrats wouldn't win in 1952. They nominate Adlai Stevenson, nice guy, not a really strong candidate. So who was the Republican nominee going to be in 1952? If Ike had not run, and I don't know to what extent we've talked about these stories before, Arch, but most likely the Republican nominee would have been Robert Taft, U.S. Senator from Ohio, which to summarize Robert Taft, I would describe him as the very isolationist, anti-New Deal wing of the Republican Party. And I think what comes down to Ike's running is basically saying that we fought the biggest war in the history of the world for all of these gains, and if we withdraw from our place in the world, then we've heard this story before. This is what happened after World War I. We had World War II, and we cannot have this. And so, as I understand, it's been described to me. He runs not to add to his legacy, because his legacy is, I'd say, is fairly established, but more to preserve the gains of the Second World War, and to also, in a really difficult time period internationally. In our next episode, we'll talk about all the different hotspots in the world where we could have gotten into full-fledged shooting wars, on top of the fact that Korea is going on at this time that he's running for president of the United States, to prevent another world war, and now we've added nuclear weapons to the mix. How do we preserve the peace? And I think that's his impetus to run.
And share with our listeners, as a 5-star general, what was Ike's characteristics of how he ran his presidency?
And I think this is what a lot of people misunderstand here. I think that people see the public persona and think that the public persona is the private persona. Ike had and I'm going to borrow the term from Fred Greenstein, who's a professor emeritus at Princeton University. Fred Greenstein, in the early 1980s, wrote an absolutely groundbreaking book called The Hidden Hand Presidency, and basically argued that the very genial, pleasant, almost bland public persona was specifically calculated by Dwight Eisenhower. Was specifically calculated by Dwight Eisenhower so that he could operate differently behind the scenes. And so I think that's just what a lot of people misunderstand. And when you take a look at how he operated, even domestically, it's just it's very much two different types of characteristics.
So when General Eisenhower becomes president, there is significant issues in the world that he has to deal with, and there are significant issues domestically that the general has to deal with. Share with our listeners, please, what are those domestic issues that he has to deal with at home.
Yeah, I can't imagine here. It's just I can't imagine the stress of the Second World War, and then you're running for president of the United States, which is a difficult job. And then, okay, what's on your plate when you get elected president in 1952? You have the Korean conflict, and that's one of Ike's promises in 1952. This is very much a foreign policy election, and Ike basically says, "I shall go to Korea. I'm going to settle this thing. I'm going to figure it out." Right now, at the time that he's elected, there is this stalemate along the 38th parallel. American boys are dying far away. There's not a clear purpose as to why this is going on. And so that's the first thing that he deals with, and he's able to, play a part in successfully negotiating not the peace treaty, but the armistice that ends the fighting between the two sides here. And then the other thing that's going on, and I think this is where we can get some agreement or disagreement about Eisenhower. The other thing is the specter of Joe McCarthy, the U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, who is on his anti-communist. I want to be careful here with McCarthy, because there's a lot of people out there who say that he's misunderstood and he's misconstrued, but he's definitely trying to root out any type of communist presence within the U.S. government. Now, this was a legitimate concern. I think Ike had similar concerns as well when he became president of the United States. But I think maybe with some of the methods that McCarthy used over his career here. And I think this is the thing where, in some types of situations, Eisenhower leadership style works, and in other ways it doesn't work for some people, that Ike never publicly mentions Joe McCarthy's name once. I actually read a story at some point where C.D. Jackson, who was one of his speechwriters, gave President Eisenhower a draft of a speech where he put McCarthy's name in there, and Ike, and now here's another reason that Ike had a very bland public persona, is that he had, behind the scenes, he had a colossal temper. Absolutely colossal, frightening to witness when he really unleashed it on people. But basically threw the speech back at C.D. Jackson and basically said, "I'm not going to get in the gutter with that guy. I'm not going to mention his name. I'm not going to give him the free publicity." So that was very much his public persona. He said this a lot, and it's from a leadership perspective, it's kind of interesting. And you kind of think about how it would work today. But he basically said, no personalities. I'm not going to get into public spats with people who I disagree with. So he never mentions McCarthy by name. But as characterized by the historian David Nichols, who wrote a book, getting into this in a lot more detail, that basically Ike takes down McCarthy. When McCarthy immolates at the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, and the guy says, "Have you no decency, sir?" That's an Ike operation all around. But as David Nichols puts it, his fingerprints are off the murder weapon. So he uses his staff. He works behind the scenes. He leaks document from the U.S. Army to the right people, demonstrating how Joe McCarthy was trying to get preferential treatment for some of his proteges within his staff, and all of these different kinds of things. He doesn't give McCarthy any oxygen by mentioning his name, and so McCarthy just has to keep doing bigger and bigger, grandiose things until he finally immolates, and that's the end of his career in 1954. And then he dies, a few years later in 1957 at a very young age. And so where people are critical of that, are critical of Eisenhower in that situation is, you needed to take a more public statement, you needed to give a speech, you needed to be out there and criticize this guy and denounce him and do all of these different kinds of things. And Eisenhower basically said, I just don't operate that way. And in his view, it wasn't an effective way of dealing with issues like that.
And Ike is the first two-term president of the Cold War. What did General Eisenhower do in the areas domestically of education for?
Yeah, this is also kind of like an interesting thing. That if we think about what's going on domestically in the United States, I guess it depends on what your perspective is, because in some ways, that people greatly associate the 1950s with happy days. They associate the 1950s with, and honestly, if you think about it, the 30s was the Depression. The 40s was World War II, and the 50s was this time period of peace, of economic expansion. We have all of these returning GI, lack of competition from Europe and Asia, which are still rebuilding from the Second World War. We've got growing suburbs. We've got a growing middle class that for a lot of people, this is a very positive time period. Now, how much credit can Ike take for that economically? He is all about balanced budgets. And he actually, and I pulled the number somewhere, that 3 of the 8 years of his presidency, he balanced the budget. The good old days, I guess, when we actually did that. And so this is a time period of economic growth. And I think too that, what kind of Republican is Dwight Eisenhower? He is a Republican that, in my opinion, would have a difficult time getting out of a Republican primary today. And I think it really demonstrates how the Republican Party has changed ideologically, with what was going to happen starting with Barry Goldwater and then Ronald Reagan. You just see a different perspective. He's not a fully New Deal supporter, but at the same time, there's elements of the New Deal that he understands are popular and people like. He actually, he adds to Social Security. He raises the federal minimum wage. Let's talk about the Interstate Highway Act, which roads that we still ride on today. an extraordinary accomplishment of his presidency that actually in dollar value adjusted for inflation was bigger than the New Deal. So the $25 billion that was spent in the 1950s, paid for with a gasoline tax for 41,000 miles of interstate highway, was of a bigger dollar value than the New Deal. And then on top of it all, Art, you mentioned with education, he does establish the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And really, from our perspective as educators, it's actually kind of interesting that the Eisenhower presidency is the beginning of a more increased federal role in education. And I think the launch of Sputnik by the Soviets in 1957 is a tipping point in that we got beat in this aspect of the space race. And so a lot of people started to say, what are we doing educationally in this country? And so you start to see more of an active federal role in education, which then LBJ really expands on in the 1960s with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and then which we're still reauthorizing today. So, there's a lot, there's just a lot of just really interesting stuff going on domestically in the United States during this time period.
And Mike, most Americans think of the 60s as the civil rights movement. Share with our listeners what went on for the civil rights movement or with the civil rights movement under President Eisenhower in the 50s.
Yeah. Now, you want to talk about where people get divided over the legacy of Dwight Eisenhower even today. And I think it's the issue of civil rights, that you have some people who commemorate Eisenhower as a very ineffective civil rights leader, I think because of misunderstandings about his leadership style. And then you have other people who argue that he was an extraordinarily effective civil rights president. And let's look at the cases on each side here. Now, obviously, a lot of the stuff with civil rights is going to come up in the second term of his presidency. We always talk about second term blues with that presidents have. Ike runs for the office in 1952, and very much on foreign policy issues. Then he gets reelected in 1956, and then spends that second term dealing with very, very difficult domestic issues, especially civil rights. Now, the fulcrum in this are the what we call colloquially the Brown versus Board of Education decisions. Basically, this class action lawsuit that make the argument that the doctrine of separate but equal, which had been established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court agrees and says that segregated schools are unconstitutional and that the nation basically needs to desegregate and integrate their school systems here. I almost don't even know where to start here, because it's kind of hard to pin down, because President Eisenhower, how shall I say this carefully here, he's doesn't say as much publicly about the issues as some people would like. And what he does say, people find a little unsatisfying. So, for example, Roy Wilkins, who was involved with the NAACP during the 1950s, said something along the lines of, if Ike had prosecuted civil rights like he had fought D-Day, we'd all be speaking German. I found a quote when I was doing my senior seminar paper as a college student that somebody said, well, we know Ike is for civil rights, but he's not going to do a lot about it. And I think what it boiled down to for President Eisenhower is that he was a practical guy. And he said at one point that you can't change hearts and minds with laws and speeches. That the changes fostered by civil rights were going to take time and weren't going to happen overnight. And then there's also a quote that happens later on where he says, appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, who is obviously the driving force behind those Brown versus Board of Education decisions. He says it's the biggest, darn fool decision that I ever made in my life, which some perceive as critical his decisions about civil rights. I'd say that's more a response to some of the other Warren Court's decisions in the 1960s about school prayer and criminal rights and different kinds of things like that Eisenhower didn't like. And so there's not that public moral outrage that some people want to see from the President of the United States. So, for example, when Emmett Till is murdered in, 1955, which is a story of great prominence, he doesn't say anything publicly, which some feel that the president should do in a situation like that. But then when you look at the other end of it, this is a hidden hand leader. It's what's more important, what he's doing or saying publicly, or what's happening behind the scenes. And when you look at the record behind the scenes, who puts Earl Warren on the Supreme Court and makes him the Chief Justice? Eisenhower. Who fills the federal courts with judges that are more supportive of civil rights policies? Eisenhower. Who finishes the desegregation of Washington, D.C.? Eisenhower. Who finishes the desegregation of the United States Army? Eisenhower. Who's behind the civil rights bill in 1957 and 1960? The civil rights bill of 1957 was the first civil rights bill since Reconstruction. Eisenhower. Created the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, made a civil rights division of the U.S. Justice Department, and as you know, very famously, when the city of Little Rock basically sent the National Guard in to prevent African American children from entering Little Rock Central High School, Ike sends in the 101st Airborne, famously, to enforce the law and to make sure those children had access to that school. And so those are all of his actions. And again, there's no right or wrong, I don't want to say right or wrong answer, but it's one of those things that's still up for debate. But when you look at the record in the long run, you see a lot of extraordinarily positive steps in that direction, even if the public persona is not what some people want to see.
And unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to end this portion of the program. The time just goes by so quickly.
It really does.
So, Dr. Karpman, we want to thank you for beginning to share with some of the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and we're going to have you back on our next program to discuss more of the foreign policies that General Eisenhower had. So,
the Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
When you experience the loss of a loved one, you can trust the Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory to guide you through the arrangements necessary to create a meaningful ceremony that celebrates the unique life being honored. Our staff is committed to providing your family with the highest quality of care and service in your time of need. We take pride in our responsibility to lighten your burden as you take the first step towards healing. Ask us about how we create a unique service for your loved one. Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory also helps with planning ahead so all the details of the service are taken care of. Ask us how we can connect you with grief support networks in your area. Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory has the resources to compassionately guide you through the loss of your loved one.
Contact us at 610-272-1941. That's 610-272-1941. Or visit our website at myersfh.com. That's MEYERSFH.com.
today we want to welcome back as our special guest, Dr. Mike Karpman. Mike, welcome back to the program.
Always a pleasure to be back, Arch.
Dr. Karpman has a bachelor's degree from Gettysburg College, a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University, and a doctorate from the University of Penn. And in our first program, Dr. Karpman was discussing the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower and his domestic policy. And Dr. Karpman is going to continue with his thinking and teaching us on the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower in his foreign policy. And Mike, would you share with our listeners again, before you go into the foreign policy, the idea of the hidden hand presidency?
Yeah, it's absolutely, I think it's an important place to start. To understand Ike is that you have to understand his leadership style and what a lot of people perceived as this very bland, detached, doddering, grandfatherly, not quite with it persona of Dwight Eisenhower was how he liked to keep things in public, but in private, he was an entirely different operator behind the scenes. And it's actually interesting too, and I'll add another layer to this as we get into foreign policy. To understand Ike as a foreign policy operator is to not only understand the hidden hand presidency, which, and again, a book for those interested, Fred Greenstein's book on the hidden hand presidency is still one of the best ones out there, and I think it really expands upon that topic. But there was another book that came out a few years ago that basically argued that if you want to get into stuff that Ike was really good at, I'm not sure golf was one of them, but if you want to get into things that Ike was really good at, he was a really good card player. They talked about how accomplished of a bridge player he was during his life, and back to his days at West Point when he was a student, they said he was a tremendous poker player. And one of the historians argued to think about Ike playing quite masterfully the biggest high-stakes poker game of the 1950s. And when you think about the world in the 1950s and all of the places where we could have easily gotten ourselves into another world war, as an extension of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there's all sorts of places where legitimate armed conflict could have emerged, and it didn't. And I don't think that was accidental. I'll never forget a moment during one of my seminar classes at Gettysburg College when I was a senior, and somebody made the argument that Dwight Eisenhower is one of the most consequential presidents in United States history, and one of the students said, but nothing happened during the 1950s. To which the response is, exactly, because a lot could have happened during the 1950s, and I don't think it's coincidental that it didn't, because of the masterful management of international affairs by President Eisenhower.
And over the years, where historically now, where does President Eisenhower rank in the listing of presidents?
Yeah, when he left the presidency in 1961, after giving his farewell address with that infamous statement about the military-industrial complex that's kind of carried up until today, a lot of people said, okay, he was okay and everything was kind of nice and he was genial and he played a lot of golf and he smiled and all that, but they didn't see him as particularly consequential. And it wasn't until the early 80s when the documents began to open up and the researchers and the historians began to get in there and say, oh my goodness, this guy was way more in charge of things than he let on during his time period. It's always interesting to look at the C-SPAN rankings. Every time there's a new president, C-SPAN gets a bunch of historians together and they rank the presidents. In the year 2000, he was ranked 9th. In 2009, he was ranked 8th. And in 2017, the latest survey, just released at right before the last inauguration, he was ranked 5th, only behind Lincoln, Washington, FDR, and TR, which I find extraordinarily fascinating. Again, you see how he was characterized by some of his political opponents during the 1950s, and it's just, again, what you see on the surface is always not what's really going on, and I think his presidency illustrates that.
And I always found it interesting that domestically at home, most Americans felt like it was a decade of peace and prosperity, which it was, and everything was just going along. And it was totally opposite of that with the foreign policy that most Americans were never aware of because of President Eisenhower.
And I think too, it's just. It's kind of funny. Like I remember saying to my mom at one point, because I really loved Happy Days when it was on TV show when I was a kid. I watched that show religiously. And I said to my mom at one point, I said, "Oh, Mom, I really wish I had lived during the 1950s. That looks so awesome." And my mom said, "Oh yeah, the 1950s were great. You know, you had to worry about, whether you were going to get polio every time you went in the swimming pool and this and that. And then the air raid drills we did all the time because we thought everybody was just going to nuke one another. That was really fun too." I think that people living during that time period, I think kind of understood that things were a little more dangerous than they seemed. But my goodness, when you look at the laundry list of all of the areas of the world that Eisenhower has to manage during the 1950s, it is just absolutely remarkable. We can talk about Iran, we can talk about Central America, we can talk about the Middle East, we can talk about Southeast Asia, we can talk about Asia, we can talk about Europe, we can talk about the Hungarian uprising in 1956. I think nothing happened with Canada. I think that was the one foreign country that didn't give us. I don't know if there was a hockey incident or something like that Ike managed during that time period. But there were so many potential hot spots that could have flared up. And I think that this is Ike the poker player right here. This is Ike not showing his cards to the rest of the world, because in some ways, if you look at his foreign policy, it's generally titled The New Look. And Ike's basic, it's actually kind of interesting. Ike's basic view is that he's fiscally responsible. He basically says we have to be, which is what he kind of says later on in his military-industrial complex speech. He said, we can't be like we were before World War II, where World War II happened and we had to turn our economy around overnight in order to build the war effort, to eventually defeat all the forces of fascism. He's like, we're in a world where somebody can hit a button and a rocket can be launched with a nuclear warhead on it, and we can't be building stuff 3 years down the line because we'll all be gone. So we basically have to be in a permanent state of readiness for threats as they may emerge. Now, is that permanent readiness large armies of men that you have in different places of the world? Not necessarily. Ike is a pretty open advocate that the potential use of nuclear weapons is a deterrent. That's where we should spend our money. That's where we can get the most bang for our buck. And really, and it's kind of ironic. It's because it's that peace through strength, for lack of a better term, that the possibility of using those weapons will ensure peace. And again, this is like the card player here. Am I going to use them? Am I not going to use them? Who knows? I might not. You don't know. He never really shows his opponents his cards. He never creates red lines. He never, makes all of these bold public statements. He keeps his opponents guessing, and I think it just helps maintain that equilibrium of the 1950s. I think it's one of those things that settles the Korean conflict when he becomes president of the United States, because Stalin has died, and I think the Soviet Union was ready to settle, and the Chinese who are on that North Korean border he kind of leaves them wondering, I could use nuclear weapons, or I could not, or I don't know. What do you think? And I think it's one of those things that just encourages the Chinese to come to the table and make that armistice agreement.
And obviously, even during the 50s, as it is today, the Middle East was a tremendous hot spot. What were some of the things that I did in the Middle East?
Well, as I was going through my notes and thinking about, how we could encapsulate Eisenhower into a couple of different situations in the time limitations of the program, there's three situations that emerge that I like, that I think illustrate different parts of his leadership. The Middle East, and it's kind of remarkable. He has a fairly serious heart attack in 1955 during his first term as president. It was sort of I don't want to say it was underestimated. It was a very serious heart attack. He had very, very serious health concerns. He's running for re-election about a year later because, running for president of the United States is really easy, even when you're the incumbent. And at the same time that he's running for re-election as president of the United States, he's dealing with situations in two parts of the world. He's dealing with the uprising in Hungary, and one of my best friends from college was of Hungarian descent, whose parents had fled Hungary in 1956 and felt a little burned by the Eisenhower administration. They were kind of given the sense that if they rose up against the Soviet Union, the U.S. would be there to help them out. And the Eisenhower administration basically said, we are not going to commit troops to a landlocked area of Europe and potentially risk an engagement with the Soviet Union and start World War III. Not going to do it. And so some Hungarians felt a little burned by that. And then on top of it all, where else could we go to add more complication to the matter? Let's bring the Middle East into play, and let's bring Egypt, and let's bring the Suez Canal. And so what had happened in Egypt in the early 1950s, the Suez Canal was under the control of the British. Egypt gets a president named Gamal Nasser, who nationalizes the Suez Canal. The British and the French and other European nations basically say, we can't have this. We can't have this canal in the hands of Egypt. We want it, we want it in European hands. And so basically, behind Eisenhower's back, Britain, France, and Israel agree to invade Suez and to try and take this canal back from the Egyptian government. And when this invasion happens, it's one of those instances I talked about in the last episode that Eisenhower had a temper. And this was one of these instances where all of these leaders saw Eisenhower's temper at its worst. And basically he sided, and this is the really interesting thing about Dwight Eisenhower, because the British and the French and the Israelis basically assumed, well, Ike is going to be on our side. Ike was not on their side. He really, and I think if we kind of want to get back into, this goes back to his experience as a young Army officer in the Philippines in the 1920s, he really didn't like colonialism. He really did not want to be the colonial master of different parts of the world, and basically sided with Nasser and the Egyptians and went to the United Nations and forced a ceasefire, and privately told Anthony Eden, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, Eden, you get your troops out of Suez, or I'm going to start a run on the British pound, and I will drive the blankety blanken thing down to zero if I have to. I will ruin you if I have to. You really need to pull your troops out of that part of the world. Excuse me. And Eden did, and was so weakened that his government fell shortly thereafter. And so I think that's just a really, really, really interesting wrinkle in that situation that people don't fully appreciate.
What were the dynamics, as you stated? Stalin dies in 1953. And then we have Nikita Khrushchev. What were the dynamics between President Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev over the years as they were in power?
Yeah, I would say fairly congenial. You take the tour at the Eisenhower farm in Gettysburg, which is a tour that everybody should do. If people haven't been to the Eisenhower farm in Gettysburg, it's a very, very, very interesting sight to see. There was definitely, I would say, at some point a thawing of the relationship. Khrushchev visited Gettysburg, and there's lots of pictures of him at the Eisenhower farm and taking a look at Eisenhower's heads of cattle and things like that. I think it was a relationship that was beginning to thaw, and then in May of 1960, the Soviets shoot down one of our U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union, and I actually wrote a paper about this in college. It was pretty fun. And so the CIA basically tells Eisenhower, "There's no way the plane survived. There's no way the pilot survived." Released this cover story about this is a NASA weather plane, and it got off course, and we're very sorry. And then, as we know, the pilot was alive, the plane was basically preserved, the film was recovered, that this was not a weather plane, that this was a plane on a spy mission. And so right at the end of Eisenhower's presidency in May of 1960, he has this enormous blow up. There's a summit that they were trying to have, and Khrushchev just lambasted the United States and then left, and so that was sort of kind of back to square one in terms of those relationships.
So we could add a fall in the Cold War, but because
possibly it was going in that direction, but the U-2 incident really destroyed any chance of that.
Do you see during his presidency and Khrushchev's reign in Soviet Union, Khrushchev actually challenging the leadership of President Eisenhower as he did with the young John Kennedy later on?
I don't think so. I think that all those guys knew what they were dealing with in terms of Ike from World War II. I mean, Khrushchev kind of has his way with Kennedy early on in his presidency, but I don't think you see that with Ike. They know who they're dealing with, and also too because of the very pokerish aspects of his leadership, they don't know what his potential move is. He subscribes to some things publicly, which as we get to Southeast Asia is really interesting. But then behind the scenes, he might be thinking things differently. It's just, in fact, if we get to it, the remarks that he gives in March of 1953 about the Formosa Strait, he's just, they know his reputation from the Second World War, and I think how he manages things just keeps people guessing.
And you just briefly mentioned this situation in Southeast Asia has been bubbling up, and unfortunately we see it really break open in the 60s. What did the general think, and what was his thinking of Vietnam and Southeast Asia and Indochina?
Yeah, in 1954, Vietnam and Southeast Asia was a Japanese possession. And so obviously when the Japanese were defeated during the Second World War, you see the beginnings of the independence movement and this guy named Ho Chi Minh, who, we'll talk about a little later on. It was actually very interesting that I was reading something about the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and Ho Chi Minh stood up at the Versailles Peace Conference asking for the independence of Vietnam, but because it was the colonial possession of the French, it wasn't even a thought. And so the French are trying to hold on to this colonial possession in 1954, and at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, that they are basically, for lack of a better term, they are surrounded by Viet Minh, by communist forces. And a lot of people want the United States to intervene. They want the United States to intervene militarily to help the French out and hold on to those European possessions in that part of the world. Ike does not want to do this for a lot of different reasons. Practical reason, we just got this armistice in Korea, and you want me to get involved militarily in another part of the world a year later? No, thank you. But also, again, this was a guy who, as an Army officer, had been in Southeast Asia. He had been in the Philippines. He understood the geography, and he basically said that there is no way that we're winning a military conflict in this part of the world. So he and on top of it all, he doesn't like colonialism. He's like, why come in and replace the French with us? That's not going to accomplish anything. But at the same time, and this is again the contrast of Eisenhower here. At the same time, he has publicly subscribed to the domino theory, which, as you know, is going to fuel our rationale for intervening more full-fledged in Vietnam in the 1960s. That China is already a communist country, and if Southeast Asia falls to communist influence, then what do you have next to Southeast Asia? India, which is the second largest nation in the world, and that could become communist. And so Eisenhower publicly subscribes to that. He has this new look foreign policy where, we want to, we want to stop the spread of communism. How do you maneuver your way out of this and not look weak? What he does in Southeast Asia, and the analogy that I draw is that, and I talk with this with students sometimes, it's kind of like when your child comes up to you and they say, can we have a pony? Can we have a dog? Can we have and there's two ways that you can say no to your child. You can just say, no, we're not going to do that. Or the other way, the more subtle way, is to say, okay, well, we'll do that, and then create a list of conditions that will never happen in a million years. And if you can do all that, then you can have a pony. And then, the child loses interest like 2 days later, and then they move on to something else. This is basically what Ike says in Southeast Asia. He goes, okay, we'll intervene militarily, but under the following conditions. He says, I want independence for Vietnam. I don't want to be a colonial master. If we're going to intervene, we're not going to do it unilaterally. Lessons that we didn't learn later on. I want an international coalition. I want the Brits. There's actually a letter where he feels out Churchill, basically saying, we failed to stop Hirohito and Mussolini and Hitler in due time. And Churchill has no interest in doing this. International coalition. And then he also wanted congressional support as well, knowing full well that one of those things probably would not happen, let alone all three. And so Dien Bien Phu falls. Now, I would say that Ike subscribes to sending advisors, keeping an eye on that part of the world. I always get that question, what would he have thought about the later Vietnam conflict? And I would summarize it as it's something that he wouldn't have done personally, but if you're going to do it, go 100% and go for victory, which is not what happened later on in Southeast Asia. But I would say that it was just an area of the world that he just wanted to avoid militarily for any one of those variety of reasons. And he was able to not provide, the support that a lot of people wanted, but to save face politically. And I think the public, he knew that the public would just not have supported an engagement like that at such a short amount of time after the end of the Korean conflict.
We just have about 2 minutes left. So would you share with our listeners the space race? And some people think it's foreign policy or domestic policy. And then on a much lighter note, share with our listeners why he had the nickname Ike.
Why did he have the nickname Ike? I honestly can't remember. Maybe do you remember why he had the nickname Ike? I off the top of my head, I can't. I can't remember.
Remember what he had 5 brothers. If you imagine their mother raising 5, and she gave all of them a different nickname. And it just so happens that she said Ike or Dwight, and it came out Ike one time. So. The brothers are really interesting, and I was just actually telling a story related to one of Ike's brothers the other day. And if you've ever seen, and again, the listeners need to go to Abilene, Kansas, to the Eisenhower homestead, and to see that really tiny house that those 5 brothers were raised in, on the other side of the tracks in Abilene, Kansas. Here's my favorite Ike brother story. So Dwight's brother, Milton, was an established academic in his own right and was a college president. He was a college president at Johns Hopkins, one of my alma maters, and also the Pennsylvania State University. And so, in fact, that there's Eisenhower libraries on both of those campuses, that neither of them are named after Dwight, but named after Milton.
One of my favorite stories is one of the years that Milton was president of Penn State University. He had invited Dwight to be the commencement speaker. And it was one of those days where the weather was very iffy. And Milton was tying himself into knots over whether to hold the commencement exercises indoors or outdoors. And basically looked at his brother and said, "Dwight, what should I do?" And Dwight looks at him and says, "Milton, you decide. I haven't worried about the weather since June 6, 1944.
Great story.
End of discussion. End of discussion.
Story.
And so I don't even know what decision they made, but that's one of my, I guess that kind of puts things in perspective a little bit. You boys decide. I haven't worried about that in a really long time.
On that note, unfortunately, again, we're up against the time. So, listeners, I promise that we're going to have Dr. Karpin back. We have not gotten nearly done with the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. So, Dr. Karpin, thank you for coming and sharing some of the information about this fascinating and wonderful president, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Always a pleasure, Arch. I really enjoy it.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing. This is 1180 AM WFYL, working for your liberty.
The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.